Inside ADX Florence, the most isolated prison in America, in the high desert of southern Colorado, there's a place where silence is enforced, where human contact is rationed, and where time does not pass the way it does anywhere else. The building looks almost sterile from above, orderly, geometric, controlled. But inside those reinforced concrete walls, men disappear into isolation so complete that some psychologists call it a laboratory for studying the limits of the human mind. This is the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, better known as ADX Florence. What happens when the federal government decides someone can no longer live among other prisoners? What kind of life remains when conversation, touch, and even the sight of another person become rare events? And what does that isolation do to a body, to a mind, to a sense of self? ADX Florence opened in 1994, operated by the Federal Bureau of Prisons. It was designed as the most secure federal prison in the United States. The official mission was simple: control inmates who were considered too dangerous, too disruptive, or too high profile for other facilities. The prison sits within a larger federal correctional complex in Florence, Colorado. But ADX is different. It is the only federal Supermax prison in the country, a place specifically engineered for near-total isolation. The architecture reflects that mission. The cells are single occupancy. The doors are solid steel. Windows are narrow slits angled so that inmates cannot see the surrounding landscape, only a strip of sky. Every design choice has a purpose. Every detail reduces risk. But security on this level comes at a cost. The men sent to ADX Florence are not there by accident. Many have committed acts of violence inside other prisons, assaulting staff, killing other inmates, orchestrating gangs from behind bars. Others are convicted terrorists, spies, or high-profile offenders whose notoriety makes them management challenges elsewhere. Among those who have been housed at ADX are members of extremist organizations, organized crime leaders, and individuals convicted in major terrorism cases. But once inside ADX, notoriety fades. Status fades. Each man becomes a number in a system that values control over identity. And here, the rules are different from almost anywhere else in the American prison system. An ADX cell measures roughly 7 by 12 feet. The bed is a slab of poured concrete. The desk and stool are molded from the same material. The sink includes a push-button faucet and a toilet unit, all designed to minimize tampering. The window is just 4 inches wide, positioned high and angled so that inmates cannot orient themselves to the outside world. You can see the sky. You cannot see the horizon. Most inmates spend at least 23 hours a day inside that space. There are no communal meals. Food arrives through a slot in the steel door. There are no work assignments in open yards. Movement is controlled, monitored, escorted. If someone spends years in this environment, what begins to change first, their habits or their mind? The day begins early. Around 6 a.m., breakfast trays are delivered individually. There is no dining hall chatter, no clatter of hundreds of inmates lining up. After breakfast, the hours stretch. Inmates may read, write letters, exercise within the limits of their cell, or watch limited television programming if they have earned that privilege. Some study legal materials. Some pace. Some sit still. At some point, recreation may be offered. But rec at ADX often means being escorted, shackled at wrists and ankles, to a small, enclosed concrete yard, sometimes referred to as a dog run. High walls, a metal grate above, a narrow patch of sky. Even here, contact is prevented. Adjacent recreation cages are separated. Isolation continues, even outdoors. Every movement inside ADX Florence is choreographed. When an inmate leaves his cell for recreation, medical appointments, or showers, he is typically placed in hand restraints, sometimes accompanied by additional security measures, depending on classification. Doors are controlled electronically. Corridors are monitored by cameras. Officers communicate constantly. The physical structure is layered, compartmentalized, redundant. Even if something goes wrong in one unit, it is unlikely to spread. The message is clear: control is absolute. But control of space does not necessarily mean control of the human psyche. ADX Florence is not a single uniform experience. The facility contains multiple units with varying degrees of restriction. Some inmates are housed in the most restrictive control units, where communication is even more limited. Others may eventually move to step-down programs designed to reward sustained good behavior with incremental increases in privileges. Progression is slow. It can take years to advance through levels. The promise of slightly more human contact becomes a powerful incentive. But what happens when someone cannot adjust? When isolation becomes not a temporary measure, but a permanent condition?
Communication at ADX is tightly regulated. Inmates may send and receive mail, though it is monitored. Phone calls are limited and often non-contact, conducted under supervision. Visits, when permitted, typically occur behind thick glass partitions. There is no handshake at the end of a visit, no embrace from a family member. Even voices may echo unnaturally through barriers. For men serving life sentences or multiple life sentences, these fragments of connection become anchors. But for others, isolation erodes relationships over time. When years pass without touch, what remains of family bonds? Critics of Supermax prisons have long focused on the psychological effects of prolonged solitary confinement. Studies have documented symptoms associated with extended isolation: anxiety, depression, hallucinations, cognitive difficulties, emotional instability. The Bureau of Prisons maintains mental health staff at ADX and screens inmates for severe mental illness. Over the years, litigation has challenged the placement of certain prisoners in extreme isolation, arguing that the conditions can exacerbate psychiatric disorders. In response, policies have evolved. Some inmates with serious mental illness have been transferred to facilities better equipped for treatment. But the broader question remains unsettled. How much isolation can a human being endure before the cost becomes irreversible? Even inside ADX, there are rules, and violations carry consequences. Infractions can result in loss of privileges, further restrictions, or placement in even more controlled environments within the facility. An inmate who assaults staff or damages property may find himself under additional limitations: fewer personal items, reduced recreation, stricter monitoring. In a prison already defined by isolation, discipline can mean even deeper solitude. And sometimes, what happens next is even more severe than the original confinement. Power at ADX Florence operates through structure rather than visible dominance. Unlike lower security prisons where inmate hierarchies and gangs can exert control over yards and housing units, the Supermax design prevents most forms of collective organization. Inmates cannot easily communicate between cells. There are no communal areas for recruitment or coordination. The balance of power is intentionally one-sided. And yet, influence can still travel through coded letters, through reputation, through legal correspondence. Even in isolation, human networks find ways to persist. Several individuals convicted in high-profile terrorism cases have been housed at ADX Florence. The rationale is straightforward: minimize risk of escape, prevent communication that could inspire or direct external networks, ensure maximum control. The facility's design, combined with monitoring protocols, makes it one of the most secure detention environments in the world. But housing ideological offenders in near-total isolation raises complex debates. Does isolation prevent radicalization, or does it intensify grievance? That question has no easy answer. Time behaves differently in solitary confinement. Without shared meals, work shifts, or social interaction, days can blur together. The only markers are meal deliveries, scheduled recreation, occasional visits. Some inmates spend a decade or more in ADX. Imagine marking the passage of 10 years through a 4-inch window. Imagine hearing mostly the sound of your own breathing. What happens to memory? To motivation? To hope? Over the years, ADX Florence has faced lawsuits challenging aspects of its operation, particularly concerning the treatment of mentally ill inmates. One major class action suit alleged that prisoners with serious mental illness were subjected to conditions that worsened their conditions. The case led to settlements requiring changes in screening and housing practices. The Bureau of Prisons has stated that ADX is used for inmates who pose unique security threats, not as a default punishment. Still, the debate over Supermax confinement continues in academic journals, courtrooms, and policy discussions. The prison remains open. The isolation remains real. Not every inmate is meant to remain in the most restrictive conditions forever. The step-down program allows prisoners to progress through levels by demonstrating sustained good behavior. With each phase, certain privileges may increase: more out-of-cell time, limited group interaction under strict supervision. The progression can take years. The possibility of transfer to a less restrictive federal prison becomes a distant but powerful goal. But the path is narrow. Any serious infraction can reset progress. Freedom is not on the horizon, only slightly less isolation.
Correctional officers at ADX operate in a highly controlled environment. Their work demands constant vigilance, procedural adherence, and awareness of risk. The individuals housed here have histories of violence, escape attempts, or ideological extremism. Interactions are professional, structured, and often brief. For staff, the psychological toll can be different, but real. Working daily in an environment built around containment and distrust requires emotional discipline. In a place defined by isolation, everyone feels it in different ways. Silence at ADX is not absolute. There are mechanical sounds, air systems, distant doors, footsteps. But compared to other prisons, the absence of collective noise is striking. No crowded yard arguments. No loud televisions in shared day rooms. Just intermittent echoes. Some former inmates have described the silence as oppressive, others as stabilizing. When there is so little external stimulation, the mind begins to fill the space. And not always gently. Since its opening, ADX Florence has maintained an extraordinary security record. There have been no successful escapes. The facility's remote location, layered perimeters, electronic surveillance, and internal compartmentalization create overlapping defenses. Escape planning requires communication. Communication requires opportunity. ADX is designed to eliminate both. But total security is an aspiration, not a guarantee. That is why vigilance never relaxes. Many inmates at ADX are serving life sentences. For them, the possibility of release does not frame daily decisions. The horizon is fixed. Some devote time to writing, legal appeals, memoirs, correspondence. Others withdraw. If a man knows he will never leave, what sustains him? Is it faith, routine, anger, acceptance? The answer differs from cell to cell. Supermax prisons like ADX Florence sit at the center of a larger national conversation about punishment and rehabilitation. Supporters argue that certain inmates present such high risks that extreme control is necessary to protect staff and other prisoners. Critics question whether prolonged isolation aligns with evolving standards of human rights and psychological research. The debate is not abstract. It shapes policies that affect real people in real cells right now. And as long as ADX stands, that debate will continue. ADX Florence remains operational, housing individuals the federal system deems the most difficult to manage. Policies adjust. Litigation influences procedure. Staff rotate. Inmates age. But the core structure remains unchanged. Single cells, limited contact, strict control. A fortress in the desert. A system built around isolation. And inside, men living year after year within walls designed to eliminate unpredictability.
ADX Florence was built to solve a problem: how to contain those who could not be contained elsewhere. It does that with precision. But the human cost of that precision is harder to measure. In a world that increasingly debates criminal justice reform, mental health, and the limits of punishment, ADX stands as an extreme example of what total control looks like. Behind every steel door is a person shaped by choices, crimes, ideology, or violence. And behind every layer of security is a question that remains unresolved. When isolation becomes a way of life, what is left of the human being inside? The desert keeps its silence. The walls do not answer. In 1995, A truck bomb destroyed the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, killing 168 people. The man convicted of carrying out that attack, Timothy McVeigh, was initially held within the federal system before his execution in 2001. His co-conspirator, Terry Nichols, received multiple life sentences. Nichols was later transferred to ADX Florence. The reasoning was not symbolic. It was operational. His notoriety, the scale of his crime, and security concerns required a level of control beyond what most federal prisons provide. Inside ADX, even someone connected to one of the deadliest domestic attacks in U.S. history occupies the same dimensions of space as everyone else. 7 feet by 12 feet. A concrete bed. A narrow window. Infamy does not expand the cell.
Ted Kaczynski, known as the Unabomber, was sentenced to life without parole for a nationwide mail bombing campaign that killed 3 people and injured many more. He was transferred to ADX Florence in 1998. For years, Kaczynski lived in isolation inside the Supermax structure, writing extensively, letters, essays, reflections. Even in confinement, he remained intellectually active, corresponding with academics and journalists within the limits of federal rules. But isolation reshapes even the most disciplined mind. Kaczynski later expressed difficulty coping with the extreme solitude of ADX. In 2021, he was transferred to a federal medical facility due to declining health. He died in federal custody in 2023. For decades, he existed in a cell built to contain not just violence, but influence. What does it mean when the most dangerous weapon is no longer physical, but ideological? Not all ADX inmates are famous outside prison walls. Some are powerful inside them. Leaders of major prison gangs, organizations capable of orchestrating violence across multiple facilities, have been housed at ADX to sever communication lines. In lower security prisons, gang influence often spreads through yard meetings, coded messages, shared housing. ADX disrupts that structure. No communal yards. No open dormitories. No informal gatherings. Letters are monitored. Calls are limited. But influence is not always loud. Sometimes it survives in whispers, in coded language, in reputation built long before isolation. Even cut off physically, some figures retain symbolic power. The question is whether isolation weakens that power or preserves it in myth. Long-term solitary confinement has been studied for decades. Psychiatrists have described a cluster of symptoms associated with prolonged isolation: hypersensitivity to stimuli, paranoia, memory lapses, emotional volatility, difficulty concentrating. In extreme cases, inmates have engaged in self-harm or displayed signs of psychosis. ADX Florence has faced legal scrutiny over the years regarding the placement of prisoners with serious mental illness. Following litigation, the Bureau of Prisons implemented enhanced mental health screening and monitoring procedures, aiming to ensure that inmates requiring intensive psychiatric care are housed in appropriate facilities. Still, even for those without pre-existing conditions, years of near-total isolation can alter cognitive patterns. When conversation becomes rare, internal dialogue grows louder. When physical movement is restricted, the mind travels elsewhere, but not always to safe places. Many inmates at ADX Florence are aging. Sentenced in their 20s or 30s, they're now in their 50s, 60s, or older. Supermax facilities were originally conceptualized to contain highly violent, actively disruptive prisoners. But time changes people. The body weakens. Health declines. Risk profiles shift. Medical staff at ADX manage chronic conditions, heart disease, diabetes, mobility issues, within the constraints of maximum security. An aging inmate in solitary confinement faces a different kind of challenge. The energy that once fueled violence may be gone, but the walls remain the same. What does Supermax incarceration mean for someone who no longer poses the threat they once did? The system evaluates behavior, not just age, and progress remains slow. For correctional officers, ADX Florence represents a different professional environment than most prisons. The risk of coordinated inmate violence is reduced because of structural separation, but the potential consequences of any lapse are severe. Officers are trained to maintain emotional neutrality, to avoid familiarity, to follow procedure without deviation. Distance is part of safety. Interactions are brief. Commands are clear. Routine is paramount. Over time, working within such a controlled and restricted space can shape perspective. Staff operate within a framework where unpredictability must be minimized. In many ways, both inmates and officers live within the architecture of control, just on different sides of the steel door. International human rights bodies have criticized prolonged solitary confinement, particularly when it exceeds 15 days, citing concerns about psychological harm. In the United States, Supermax prisons remain legally permissible, upheld by courts as constitutional when conditions meet basic standards and serve legitimate security interests. ADX Florence continues to operate under federal oversight, subject to internal review and legal accountability. The debate is not about whether certain individuals committed serious crimes. That is established in court. The debate centers on what punishment should look like after conviction. Is total isolation a necessary safeguard, or does it represent an extreme that future generations may reconsider? There is no national consensus, but as long as ADX exists, the question remains active. From a distance, ADX Florence appears almost insignificant against the scale of the Colorado desert. Mountains in the background, endless sky above, silence stretching in all directions. Inside, the routine continues. Breakfast through a slot, a measured hour of recreation, a brief medical check. Lights out. For some, this has been life for decades. No physical contact, no communal conversation, no horizon beyond a narrow slit of sky. ADX Florence was built to solve a problem: how to contain individuals deemed too dangerous for any other environment. By measurable standards, it has succeeded. Escapes have not occurred. Large-scale disturbances are rare. Control is constant. But the deeper question lingers beneath the concrete and steel. What does prolonged isolation do? Not just to the incarcerated, but to a society that chooses it as a solution. Punishment, in its most severe form, is visible here in architecture. Walls that absorb sound, doors that do not yield, cells designed to outlast the men inside them. The desert remains unchanged. The prison remains operational. And somewhere behind reinforced steel and poured concrete, another day passes in near silence, measured not by freedom, nor by rehabilitation, but by endurance. Life inside ADX Florence is not loud. It is not chaotic. It is not cinematic. It is controlled. It is isolated.